Thank you for that introduction. So, yep, I'm Shannon Proksch, and I'm here to talk to you today about one of my projects. This is funded by the National Science Foundation. It's a research traineeship specifically on intelligent adaptive systems. So while my primary PhD work involves studying the neural dynamics of beat and rhythm perception in the brain when listening to music, this project, like Adrian said, is specifically about coordination dynamics in large groups of people. So we're not necessarily looking at the brain here. And this project is a collaboration between myself and my research partner, Marley Reeves, who's a PhD candidate in the Applied Mathematics Department at the University of Merced, as well as Michael Spivey and my advisor, Ramesh Balasubramaniam, both of the Cognitive and Information Sciences Department. So a few things to note before we get started. If you have microphones, make sure they're off so we don't get distracted at all. And then for you, sometimes the screen will go black. And this is a feature, it's not a bug. This is just a technique to draw your attention away from the slides and back towards me and whatever it is I'm saying, and also to give your eyes a bit of a rest, because I tend to have pretty busy slides. And second, there's a couple of video clips with sound interspersed throughout, and some of these can get quite loud, so I'll try to warn you before I press play in case you need to adjust your volume at all. And there's also this graphic here that you'll see on any slide if there's going to be audio. Oh, and one more thing, I generally don't look at the chat until after the talk, so if you guys want to go on side quests or chat with each other during the talk at all, go ahead. I won't be looking at it, so it won't be a distraction. Anyway, let's get started. So my colleague Marley and I, we came into this research partnership on intelligent adaptive systems, and we were interested in one of, we argue, the most interesting intelligent adaptive systems that there are, systems of humans. Humans, of course, are a massively social species. We interact in social groups at a variety of scales, from the simple dyad to even larger social groups. We were interested in particular with the question of how it is that humans coordinate their interactions with other humans, especially among large groups of people. And naturally, or perhaps naively, the first form of interaction that popped up to us as important is the form of interaction that we call synchrony. So humans are always searching for what makes us different or special, and it has been argued that the capacity for entrainment or synchronizing may have evolved in humans as a feature of early social and musical activity sometime after the split from our hominid relatives. So while apes and chimpanzees may exhibit spontaneous drumming activity in the wild, they don't perform socially, either in pairs or in groups, nor do they readily entrain with an external metronome or with other apes. Adding on to our evolutionary story, humans demonstrate a social drive to entrain with each other, from walking in step to eventually clapping in the same rhythm after an unusually long applause. Importantly, when two or more humans are synchronizing like this, they form a unit, a complex system, or a synergy, by which they are both constraining and constrained by the behavior of the other person with whom they're interacting. And this tendency to synchronize doesn't have to be intentional. In fact, many times, we aren't even aware of this synchronization at all. In a series of rocking chair experiments, you can even rig the game. So humans will actively, automatically, and unintentionally rock in synchrony with a neighboring participant in another rocking chair, even if you rig the game by attaching weights to one of the chairs so that the rocking chairs have a different natural period. Additionally, entrainment and synchronization are closely linked to social cooperation, cohesion, and bonding. A series of experiments from Wiltermuth and Heath showed that unintentional synchronous activity among two individuals increased trust and cooperation in a subsequent game theoretic task. And listeners in this study from Polianskaya and colleagues can also perceive social interaction or friendliness between two interlocutors that they're listening to based on similarity of rhythmic patterns in each individual's speech output. Now, I've mostly been talking about synchronous behavior among dyads, but what my collaborators and I really wanted to investigate was where, when, and what kinds of synchronous behavior are occurring in large multi-agent groups of people. And the fact is, when studying multi-agent group dynamics, the behavior of a musical ensemble is a great place to start. In a musical ensemble, each agent in the group usually has easily defined roles relative to other members of the ensemble. And sometimes there's even a script that can help guide you to know where specific types of coordination behavior might occur. Synchronization in musical activities can occur in a variety of ways, such as when a musician's limbs are coordinated with each other, like your two hands on the drum. When a musician coordinates their actions with another musician in the group, like this band you see on stage, or when groups of musicians coordinate their activity among other groups of musicians within a larger group, such as the violin section coordinating their actions with the woodwind sections of this orchestra. And these forms of coordination that we've just talked about have been termed intra-individual, inter-individual, and intergroup, respectively, from Martin Clayton in a paper in 2012. And we actually see the same synchronous coordinating relationships that intentionally occur between members of musical ensembles, and these same synchronous coordination relationships are responsible for emergent synchrony that arises between members of a group, even when they're not intending to make some sort of joint product, like a piece of music. Now, you may have noticed a subtle change in my language here. I began talking about synchrony, but there was a brief correspondence in Nature in 2017, and Andrea Ravignani noted that it's quite common to talk of synchrony as referring to loose coordination patterns among individuals or populations. But perhaps it's more clear when we discuss these patterns of interaction to refer to broader category of coordination, because synchrony refers in physics and mathematics to a specific form of coordination where the precise, referring to the precise coincidence of events in time. So more broad, for the rest of today's talk, I'll be referring to coordination in multi-agent groups, among which synchrony is certainly an important mode of coordination, but it's far from the only mode of coordination that might emerge in dyads or in medium or larger interacting groups. And indeed, various patterns and conditions for emergent coordinations between individuals has been a subject of laboratory study for decades. Spontaneous or emergent patterns of entrainment are observed between individuals by analyzing video and motion capture from interacting dyads, swinging pendulums, or rocking in rocking chairs. Recent work that I didn't picture here has evaluated motor coordination dynamics in terms of body sway in more naturalistic interactions, such as interactive problem solving and naturalistic conversation between individuals. If it was pictured, this is work from Alexandria Paxton and Rick Dale and my colleague Sarah Schneider at UC Merced. But now referring to what you're seeing on the screen, coordinated body movements have also been evaluated between speed dating partners, and both motor and acoustic coordination has been studied in performing musicians and duets, as well as larger ensembles. And we start to observe leadership and follower dynamics, as well as different forms of coordination that emerge when you're creating or improvising a piece of music. In each of these interactions, some motor or acoustic behavioral output of each interacting individual was measured and analyzed for meaningful correlations between these individuals. Importantly, in these studies, it has been possible to obtain clear measurements of individual behavior to examine the emergent coordination dynamics of multi-agent interaction and social self-organization of the group as a whole. But what if we don't have access to individual behavioral measurements, like you see in this crowd here? In fact, what if we don't even have a video camera? This brought us to the question that Marley and I really wanted to tackle. Can we describe the dynamics of multi-agent human interaction just by listening? And as part of this research traineeship, we're investigating this phenomena in two examples of multi-agent behavior. First, by analyzing the acoustic output of a group of musicians in a musical performance, and second, by analyzing the acoustic output of a crowd at a basketball game. And today, of course, we're going to be focusing on the musicians. So our basic theoretical assumption is that if a multi-agent group has self-organized into a complex system, or a system whose local independent interactions between individuals give rise to emergent dynamics at the level of the system as a whole, if such a multi-agent group has self-organized into a complex system, then the interdependence between the agent's functions should make it possible to detect that coordination from almost any time series emitted from that system using state space reconstruction. And we'll dive into those details in just a little bit. For now, suffice to say that if it is not feasible or practical to obtain individual level measurement or acoustic measurements when obtaining group behaviors in the wild, then global measures should be sufficient. And one of the simplest global measures to employ is an acoustic recording taken from a well-placed microphone, maybe a couple microphones. Before we go much further, I'm recruiting some help from the Mythbusters to explain one of the simplest dynamical systems. There will be sound, it might be a little bit loud.
Adam doubles his trouble with 2 metronomes set to the same tick mark.
Look at the movement on this platform.
And after 2 minutes, the shimmy takes over.
Stay with it, boys. Nice. Nice, it's totally working. It just took them a little while to find each other's rhythm. Cool. I have an idea. If I stop the platform, they should drop out of phase. There it is. The moving platform is totally critical to this experiment.
All right, so metronomes, why does this matter? So partially because in physics, we tend to model interacting groups, especially if they synchronize as a set of coupled oscillators. But mostly I want to show you here that Adam Savage has done something. He's replicated the findings of a centuries-old experiment originally conducted with pendulums. And what you heard were 2 metronomes slowly coming into phase with each other. They were becoming interdependent on each other's behaviors because they were connected by a coupling mechanism. As Adam correctly notes, the moving platform is totally critical. In fact, when he stops the platform, the metronomes are no longer coupled and their behavior no longer affects the other. The platform can take on many forms. It can be round like this. It can be between a couple chairs or a couple of clocks on a wall. And as long as the platform is freely flowing and responsive to the metronome's movement, you will see the emergence of coordinated acoustic behavior from this coupling mechanism. In humans, the coupling mechanism need not be a physical platform. In fact, we argue that it's the interaction itself, which serves as a coupling mechanism for multi-agent human behavior. And we're going to spend just a little bit more time with metronomes today before we get to real human groups. So what we're going to hear next is the acoustic output from 32 metronomes on a freely moving platform. And using this set of metronomes, I'm going to justify to you, 1, that we can identify emergent coordination behaviors in acoustic data, and 2, what all that technical language I used earlier about state space reconstruction is really about and why it helps us here. So this is a video of 32 metronomes. You're going to see them transitioning from uncoordinated random phase to coordinated synchronous phase. And since it's actually a little long, I might skip the transition part and just show you part of the beginning and part of the end. So you can see they're all moving in random phase to each other. And after they've sat on this platform for a while, so the platform here serves as a coupling mechanism. And as synchronization between the metronomes emerges, they begin to sound like one group, maybe a little bit fuzzy, but more or less like one really loud metronome. This is an example of the type of data we'll be investigating for the emergence of coordination and acoustic signals. So we don't have access to the video, we've just extracted the audio. First, let's review a little bit of theory, and then I will show you what we extract from these audio from the metronomes. So according to Tockin's theorem, in a loosely coupled complex dynamical system, such as these metronomes or interacting groups of musicians, information about the entire system is encoded in each of its individual subcomponents. We can reconstruct the behavior of the system as a whole by measuring only one of its parts. This is accomplished by embedding delayed copies of a single time series into multiple dimensions. What you see on this slide here is a single time series extracted from the Lorentz system, delayed to make another time series, and then delayed once more to make a third. We take these 3 dimensions and use them to reconstruct a projection of the Lorentz system. This phase space reconstruction, we call it, maintains the same topography as the original Lorentz system. In the case of our metronomes, we can take that sound, the acoustic signal, and extract a time series of the metronome's group level acoustic behavior, and follow these steps to reconstruct their behavior over time. Once we have completed phase space reconstruction, we can visualize the behavior of our system by generating recurrence plots. This is done by plotting recurrent points from the reconstructed phase space within some radius. We can evaluate these structures and these recurrence plots using recurrence quantification analysis. And on the right here are a few examples of time series, their reconstructed phase space, and their recurrence plots. One of the simplest measures we can glean from these plots are the rate that states reoccur. This is called simply the recurrence rate. On the left here, we see a time series of a simple sine wave. And of course, if we reconstruct the phase space of a sine wave, we get something like a circle. We then plot a point on our recurrence plot every time our system revisits a portion of its phase space. And in this recurrence plot, we start to see these diagonal lines. Diagonal lines in recurrence plot reflect deterministic behavior, and they track how similar sequences of values change over time. A sine wave is reliably deterministic, and as such, we see these long diagonals. The recurrence value we extract here, as expected, is called determinism. In the middle, we see uncorrelated white noise, and the time series is random. The phase space that we reconstruct is similarly random. As a result, we see little to no diagonal structures or any other structures in our recurrence plot. And finally, on the right, we see a time series extracted from speech. It looks a lot like our sine wave, but it's a bit of a transient signal. And it's a little bit deterministic. So we see some diagonal lines. This is not the line to pay attention to in the middle, but rather these ones on either side of this center line. And you see that the lengths of these diagonals vary. And we report this variation with a value called entropy. Finally, recurrence plots can also contain vertical structures in addition to diagonals. You don't see any here, but these vertical structures occur when states do not change for some period of time. And we measure these with a value called linearity. Linearity, in contrast with determinism, measures how a signal is organized in terms of similar absolute values that are stable over time. And just because that can be a lot of words, here's another diagram to summarize the RQA measures that we are primarily interested in. So recurrence rate, simply the recurrence of points over time, represents patterns of behavior that repeat over time. Determinism here represents behaviors that belong to a longer sequence of behavior, usually over 2 or 3. Entropy, it's our variability in lengths of these diagonal lines. It represents disorder in the system. And then finally, linearity, clusters of behavior for any length of time. You can think of this as when a system visits a behavior for a period of time, leaves, and then returns to that same behavioral state. All right, so thank you for going on that theoretical journey with me. Now that you know how recurrence plots are generated, you know how to interpret them, we're going to return to our metronomes. And the simple question we're asking of our metronomes is, are there differences in nonlinear recurrence dynamics measured by RQA between the uncoordinated and coordinated acoustic behavior of this group of metronomes on a shared platform? And the answer is yes. So what you see here are the time series and recurrence plots for 30 seconds of uncoordinated sound right here from the start of our metronome performance, and 30 seconds of coordinated, in this case, synchronous sounds near the end of our metronome recording. You can see this first recurrence plot. It looks a lot like the plot of uncorrelated white noise that we saw earlier. And in the second plot, we see the emergence of some vertical structures, indicating periods of laminar or stable states in our group metronome acoustic behavior. We can see even more fine-grained details and evaluate recurrence plots from 5-second recordings. So now we're seeing 5-second recordings of uncoordinated behavior here and coordinated behavior here. So we're seeing the same structures emerging in our recurrence plot, and you can also more clearly see spikes in the time series here at regular intervals, and this would correspond to each click of the metronome group. So this is great. You've learned everything you need to know to evaluate the emergence of coordination measured from a global acoustic signal and visualized in a recurrence plot. Let's apply all of this to human data. Remembering that for metronomes, the platform is the essential coupling mechanism for the emergence of coordinated acoustic behavior. However, in humans, the coupling mechanism doesn't need to be a shared physical platform. Instead, we claim it is the interaction that is totally critical. The interaction itself serves as a coupling mechanism for multi-agent human behavior. So our model multi-agent system is a group of musicians performing a piece called Welcome to the Imagination World. Now, pre-pandemic, I was going to perform this piece with the Fresno Community Concert Band, which is how I discovered it. And to tell you a little bit about the piece, Welcome to the Imagination World was composed to do something interesting and unusual in terms of a musical performance. The composer wrote the first few minutes of this piece to be completely random. In music theory terms, we can call this aleatoric, when some elements of the music are left up to chance or to whatever the performers decide to play in the moment. So the start of this piece sounds a little bit like this. All right, and that piccolo can get a little loud, so I'll go ahead and pause it right there. So what you're hearing here is not musicians warming up on stage. This is the actual music. And the musicians themselves are instructed at this point not to interact with each other. After a few minutes, the musical score directs the musicians to coordinate. And that sounds a little bit like this. And so at this point, they begin to sound like one interacting musical ensemble, rather than a collection of a bunch of individuals on stage. So to recap here, the musical interaction serves as the coupling mechanism. And as coordination between the musicians arises, they begin to sound like one musical ensemble, co-creating a musical performance. Now, we aren't seeing emergent or spontaneous interaction in this particular composition and performance, as musicians are told by the musical score precisely when to begin coordinating their behavior. And in this particular performance, the divide between uncoordinated and coordinated joint musicking is made even more apparent by the fact that the lights turn on and the conductor arrives on stage just as the musicians begin to play together as one ensemble. Nevertheless, we could clearly hear the difference between uncoordinated individual musicians and the coordinated musical ensemble. And it arrives at the question, the reason you came to this talk, we want to ask, are there differences in the nonlinear recurrence dynamics measured by our QA between the uncoordinated and coordinated acoustic behavior of this musical ensemble? And just like with our metronomes, the answer is yes. So we also have 30-second samples here. At the top, you're seeing 30 seconds from the beginning and the end of that uncoordinated section, the aleatoric part of the music. At the bottom, we're hearing the first and last 30 seconds of the coordinated section right here. So this is after the conductor appears, just to avoid the audience applause that happens when the conductor walks on stage. So this is the first 30 seconds after the conductor appears. and then the last 30 seconds of the song. And we can see that the acoustic behavior from musicians in these coordinated sections of the music is more structured, and there's vertical bursts of connected structures of sound. We can look even closer at the 5-second samples, and we see the same vertical structures in the coordinated, but not coordinated sections, not in the uncoordinated sections here. And these are a lot messier than our metronomes, of course, because we're not only observing synchronous behavior, but perhaps a variety of coordinating behaviors or overlapping behaviors that may not be particularly synchronous or anti-synchronous between groups of musicians over time. So it's a lot messier in this more natural multi-group interaction. Well, this interaction includes humans rather than mechanical metronomes. So we can perhaps learn even more if, instead of just looking at those recurrence plots, we look at distributions of the measures that we extract from them. So we mentioned recurrence rate, entropy, linearity, determinism. And you can see in this plot, you can see coordinated sections of the piece in blue here at the top and uncoordinated in red. So what you're seeing is that when the musicians began interacting with each other as a coordinated musical ensemble, recurrence and stability measures increased overall. So you see higher values of recurrence rates and more variability in them when they are coordinated versus the beginning of the piece when they're behaving randomly and not coordinating with each other. Higher values of determinism and more variability in these values. Higher values of entropy and more variability, and higher values of linearity and more variability in these values in the coordinated as compared to the uncoordinated section of musical performance. And we can see this even more clearly if we plot these recurrence measures over time. So now you're seeing these 5-second samples, and since they're 5-second samples and we slide by 1 second, take another 5-second sample, slide by 1 second, take another one, you end up seeing 25 samples plotted here. And you see here a blue and purple line. These lines correspond to the coordinated section of the music, and they're exploring a variety of states. They exhibit a variety of recurrence rates, determinist measures, entropy measures, and linearity. Whereas at the beginning of the piece, we're hovering in these orange and green sort of lines, we're hovering around the same values throughout the entirety of those 30-second samples. So that was a bunch of graphs, but what have we learned? So I'm gonna throw a bunch of pictures on the slide here to just recap what we've discussed today. So when wanting to learn something about social behavior, music provides a good model system. You know roughly and can manipulate the roles that each member of the musical groups performs. And sometimes you even have the aid of a musical script to be able to carefully track the coordination dynamics that you expect to emerge in joint music making. The same intentional interdependencies which arise from a group of musicians co-creating music together can also emerge as a result of local interactions between individuals and large interacting groups of people, like crowds. But measuring coordination dynamics in multi-agent groups is really hard. Many studies rely on having some form of measurable signal available from each individual of the group, and then searching these signals for correlations between members of that interacting group. We've demonstrated that, following from Takin's theorem, you can take one global signal emitted from an interacting group, such as an audio recording from a simple microphone, submit that signal to phase-based reconstruction and recurrence quantification analysis, and quantify and visualize differences in recurrence dynamics exhibited from that group's behavior. And because we know something about the system emitting this signal, we are able to pair our measurements with what we hear from the performance of this musical ensemble and the scripted behavior dictated by the musical score. So when the function of each musician becomes interdependent with the functions of other musicians, the group becomes a complex system. And we did note that we aren't seeing emergent or spontaneous self-organization in this particular performance, since musicians are being told by the musical score precisely when to begin coordinating their behavior. But as a model system, and to borrow a phrase from Alessandro D'Asilio and colleagues, this musical ensemble constitutes a microcosm that provides a platform for modeling the complexity of human social interactions. So we can conclude the collective cognition that takes place in order to generate coordinated music such as this makes the group of musicians function a little bit like one large mind, one complex system. And when that collective mind has an audio time series extracted from it, that is subjected to state space reconstruction, it can provide insight into how and when those individual musicians achieve their coordinated behavior, and maybe allow us to treat this as an upper bound of the types of coordinated behavior we can expect to see in interacting groups in the wild, off stage, maybe a crowd at a basketball game. So that concludes my talk. Just want to acknowledge my collaborators again. This is Marley Reeves, PhD candidate in applied mathematics, my advisor, Ramesh Balasubramaniam, and our collaborator, Michael Spivey. So thank you very much. If you want to learn more about me or our NSF traineeship or our department or my lab, you can click any or visit any of these links. I suppose you can't click on them. We're in a video, but thank you for listening to me, and I would love to answer any of your questions.